There's a particular kind of failure that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with a good team quietly working against itself. It happens when every person on that team is doing their own job well, individually, competently, and the whole effort still falls apart because nobody was covering anyone else. Each piece was fine. The seams between the pieces were the problem. Extreme ownership calls this principle cover and move, and it comes from a simple, almost obvious-sounding idea once you hear it stated plainly. No part of a team succeeds by only worrying about its own piece of the mission. Every element has to understand that its own success and the success of the elements around it are, in practical terms, the same success. You cover their gaps. They cover yours. A team where everyone is technically excellent at their individual task, but nobody looks sideways to see what the person next to them needs, isn't actually a team. It's a collection of individuals who happen to be standing near each other. And collections like that tend to fail in exactly the places where two individual jobs were supposed to overlap and quietly didn't. I want to spend this whole episode on that idea, because on the surface it seems like the one principle in this entire book least suited to something you do alone at dawn with no one else around. And for a while I thought that too. It took actually living with a training breakdown that had nothing to do with effort or ownership or ego to see that cover and move applies here, just as directly, just aimed at a different kind of team than the one the book is describing. It's worth pausing on why this one felt like the hardest fit at first, before getting into how it actually applies. The first four ideas in this book, absolute ownership, the standards you actually enforce, believing in the mission, checking the ego, all live comfortably inside a single person, because they're really about how you relate to yourself. Cover and move is explicitly about the space between people, about gaps that only exist because there's more than one part working toward the same outcome. A solo runner on the surface doesn't have that space. There's no teammate to leave uncovered. It took me a long time to see that the space still exists, just relocated inside the different systems and relationships that all have to work together to make one runner actually functional over the long term. Here's the version of the mistake I made, and I suspect a version of it is familiar to a lot of people listening to this. I treated running as the whole mission, the one job that mattered, and I treated everything else, strength work, sleep, mobility, nutrition, as background tasks, optional support functions with no real claim on my actual effort or attention. Running was the thing I was proud of, the thing that showed up on the tracker, the thing this channel is even named after. Everything else felt like someone else's job, if it felt like anyone's job at all. What that actually built, without me noticing for a long time, was a team of one where only one member ever showed up fully trained, and every other member, every supporting system the running actually depended on, was left completely uncovered. The mileage was excellent. The hips supporting that mileage had never been strengthened. The sleep that was supposed to let the legs actually absorb the training had been treated as negotiable for years. Running, on its own, was never actually the whole mission. It was the one visible piece of a mission made up of several parts that all needed to cover each other. And I'd only ever been training the one part anyone could see. Asterisk, asterisk. The injuries that eventually showed up weren't a failure of the running. The running, taken in isolation, had been reasonably sound. They were a failure of cover. Every neighboring system that should have been supporting the mileage was left exposed, uncovered, undefended, while all the attention and discipline poured into the one job that happened to be visible on screen. I remember the specific week this actually became undeniable rather than just a vague suspicion. A physical therapist, looking at the pattern of complaints I'd brought in, asked a simple question that stopped me. When's the last time you did any dedicated strength work for your hips and glutes, separate from the running itself? The honest answer was somewhere close to never, in any structured, ongoing sense. She wasn't surprised. The pattern she was looking at, she said, was less a running injury than a support injury, a case of one very well-trained system, the mileage, being asked to compensate for several undertrained systems around it that had simply never been given their own dedicated attention. That reframing stuck with me longer than almost anything else in this whole process, because it wasn't a lecture about effort. It was a description of a coverage gap, plain and specific, with an obvious next action attached to it. There's a specific kind of thinking the book identifies as the enemy of this whole principle, and it's worth naming directly because it's exactly the thinking I fell into, the idea that that's not my job. In a real team, this shows up as someone refusing to help with a task technically outside their assigned role, even while a teammate right next to them is clearly struggling with it. Applied to training, it shows up as a much quieter internal sentence, one that doesn't even sound like an excuse at the time. Strength training isn't really running, so it's not really part of what I'm building here. Stretching isn't really running. Sleep isn't really running. Each of those sentences sounds reasonable in isolation. Stacked together, they describe a runner who spent years covering exactly one sector of a much larger mission, while leaving every adjacent sector completely open. What makes this particular trap so easy to fall into, compared to some of the earlier ideas in this book, is that it doesn't feel like avoidance from the inside. Skipping a run because of an excuse feels like avoidance, and most people, once they're paying attention, can catch that feeling fairly quickly. Skipping strength work because that's not really the thing I'm building doesn't feel like avoidance at all. It feels like focus. It feels, if anything, like discipline, a narrow and admirable dedication to the one real task, uncluttered by side projects. That's exactly what makes it dangerous. The excuse has disguised itself as a virtue. And virtues are much harder to question than excuses, because nothing about them triggers the part of you that's usually on guard for rationalizations. I want to walk through a few different places this shows up, because cover and move ends up meaning something slightly different depending on which sector you've been leaving exposed. The most literal version is physical. The actual muscles, joints, and systems that support running but aren't, strictly speaking, running itself. Strength work covering the joints. Mobility work covering the range of motion that keeps form efficient under fatigue. Nutrition covering the energy and repair that mileage alone can't manufacture on its own. None of these are the mission's headline. All of them are covering fire for the part that is. Neglecting them isn't a shortcut that saves time for more running. It's leaving your own flank open while the part of you that's visible keeps advancing, exposed for longer than it can actually sustain. There's a reason this particular gap is so easy to leave open for years without noticing. And it's worth naming plainly. Covering fire, by definition, doesn't produce visible forward progress on its own. A strength session doesn't add a mile to the tracker. A stretching routine doesn't show up as a new personal best. Every visible marker of progress in this sport lives in the one system that was already getting all the attention, which makes it almost structurally tempting to keep pouring effort into the visible part and treat everything covering it as optional, right up until the exposed part finally gets hit. A second version is less physical and more about motivation itself. And this one surprised me more than the first. On any given week, discipline and motivation aren't actually the same resource, even though they get talked about interchangeably. Some mornings motivation shows up on its own, genuinely wanting to go. Other mornings it doesn't, and discipline has to cover for it completely, carrying the whole weight of the decision with nothing but habit and prior commitment behind it. The mistake is expecting one of those two to handle every morning by itself. A runner who only ever moves on motivated days has left discipline completely uncovered, with nothing built up to catch the morning's motivation doesn't show. A runner who tries to run purely on discipline with no attention to whatever actually restores real motivation wears that discipline down faster than it can be rebuilt. They're supposed to be covering for each other, trading off depending on which one is stronger on a given day, not each pretending the other doesn't need to exist. I noticed this most clearly during a stretch a while back where I'd been running purely on discipline for almost 2 months straight. No real enthusiasm behind any of it. just showing up because the standard had been set and I wasn't willing to break it. It worked, technically, in the sense that the streak stayed intact. But something underneath, it was quietly eroding the whole time. The same way a muscle that's never allowed to rest eventually stops responding the way it used to. By the end of that stretch, even the discipline itself had started to feel thin, harder to summon than it had been at the start because nothing was covering it. What eventually helped wasn't more willpower. It was deliberately rebuilding motivation on its own terms for a while, a new route, a specific short-term goal, something that had nothing to do with grinding through and everything to do with wanting to go again. So that discipline had a partner to hand the weight to instead of carrying all of it alone, indefinitely. A third version, and probably the one that took me longest to actually accept, is external rather than internal. The people, schedules, and circumstances around your training that either get support or get quietly ignored because acknowledging you need them feels like it undercuts the whole solo. No excuses image this channel is built around. For a long time, I treated any accommodation, any flexibility from work, any support from someone at home covering a task so I could get out the door at 5 as something slightly embarrassing to admit, as if real discipline meant needing nothing from anyone. That's backwards, and it's a misreading of the principle, not an application of it. Cover and move was never an argument for pure self-sufficiency. It's an argument against pretending you don't need cover at all, which is its own quiet, exhausting way of leaving a flank open. Asterisk, the people willing to adjust a schedule, cover a task, or simply not make an early run harder than it needs to be aren't undermining the discipline. They're the actual team this whole idea describes, whether or not any of them ever laces up a shoe themselves. There was a stretch early on where I never once mentioned to anyone at home how much the early alarm was actually costing the rest of the household in small, quiet ways. Because admitting it felt like admitting the whole project was a burden rather than a solitary discipline I was handling entirely on my own. What actually happened once I finally said it plainly, that the schedule was hard on more than just me, wasn't resistance. It was a small adjustment, offered without much fuss, that made the mornings noticeably easier almost immediately. The flank had been open the entire time, not because nobody was willing to cover it, but because I'd never actually signaled that it needed covering. There's a fourth version worth naming specifically because of the format this channel is built on. An audience isn't just people watching a solo pursuit from the outside. Handled honestly, it can function as a real version of cover, in the sense the book actually means it. Someone in the comments who's a few weeks behind you on the same kind of comeback, reading that you also had a bad week, gets something closer to real cover than another polished highlight would ever give them. The sense that the sector they're worried about exposing publicly is a sector plenty of other people are quietly exposed into. That's not a small side effect of making this stuff public. It might be the most literal version of cover and move available to a channel built around one person running alone. And it's part of why I keep including the weeks that didn't go well instead of editing them out. This works in both directions, too, which took me a little longer to notice. It's easy to think of an audience only as something that receives cover, gets reassured, gets the honest version instead of the polished one. But plenty of mornings, it's worked the other way, where knowing someone out there is genuinely following along, genuinely invested in whether the specific project keeps going, has covered a gap in my own motivation on a day it was running low. That's not vanity, or at least I don't think it has to be. A real team covers in both directions, constantly, without keeping precise score of who owes whom. An audience that's actually engaged with the honest version of this, rather than a curated highlight reel, ends up functioning less like spectators and more like a very loosely organized, very distributed version of exactly the kind of team this whole chapter describes. I want to be careful not to overstate that, because it would be easy to lean on it as its own kind of excuse, the vague comfort of an audience standing in for the harder, more specific covering that still has to happen elsewhere. An audience can genuinely help. It cannot do strength training for your hips, and it cannot have the honest conversation at home that's actually overdue. It's one sector among several, useful and real, but not a substitute for any of the others. There's a boundary worth drawing here too, the same way every chapter so far has needed one, because this idea can get misread in a direction that quietly undoes everything extreme ownership actually stands for. Cover and move is not permission to lean on support as a substitute for your own effort. The way a teammate who expects everyone else to compensate for their own laziness isn't practicing the principle, they're exploiting it. The whole idea only works because every part of the team is still doing its own job fully and covering for the parts that need it on top of that, not instead of it. Getting support from a flexible schedule or an understanding partner doesn't replace showing up and doing the actual training. It just means the training doesn't have to be defended alone on every single front all the time, as if needing help were itself a form of weakness rather than the ordinary condition every functioning team, including a team of one, actually operates under. There's a fairly reliable test for telling the difference between genuine cover and quiet exploitation of the idea, and it's worth having ready before this gets used as a justification for anything. Genuine cover shows up after you've already done your own part fully, filling a gap that's still there despite real effort, not instead of that effort. Exploitation shows up as a reason not to start the effort in the first place, dressed up in the same language. If the support is helping you do more of what you were already doing honestly, it's cover. If it's become the reason you stopped doing your own part at all, it stopped being cover and started being an excuse borrowed from a principle that was never meant to carry that weight. So here's what this looks like as a practice, kept narrow the same way every episode so far has been. Pick one sector you've been leaving uncovered, specifically because it doesn't feel like the real mission the way running itself does. For some people, that's strength work. For others, it's sleep or nutrition or simply admitting out loud to one other person that this is hard and support would actually help. Name the specific sector, not a vague intention to do better, the exact gap. I have not done a single dedicated strength session in the last 2 months, or I have never once asked anyone for the small accommodation that would make the early mornings noticeably easier. Then ask the cover and move question directly, instead of the discipline question you normally reach for. Not, why haven't I been disciplined about this? But what part of the mission have I been treating as someone else's job, or as not really part of the job at all, while leaving it completely exposed? Once the gap is named that way, as a coverage problem rather than a character flaw, the next step tends to be obvious and a lot less loaded than it felt a minute earlier. Pick the smallest realistic version of actually covering that sector this week. One session, one honest conversation, one small ask, rather than a complete overhaul of everything at once. I want to be specific about what smallest realistic version actually means, because vague versions of this advice tend to evaporate by Wednesday. If the uncovered sector is strength, that doesn't mean designing a full program this week. It means one session, 15 minutes, aimed at the single weakest link a physical therapist or a bit of honest self-assessment would flag first. Usually the hips or the calves for most runners carrying old injuries. If the uncovered sector is the external, human one, it doesn't mean a long, heavy conversation about everything the schedule has cost everyone involved. It means one specific, small, nameable ask stated plainly this week rather than carried silently for another month. Small and specific beats, thorough and vague, almost every time, because small and specific actually survives contact with an ordinary Tuesday. I'll add one thing that's helped me hold on to this practically, because good intentions about covering more sectors evaporate fast without something concrete attached to them. Once a month, I run through a short, honest list: strength, sleep, nutrition, mobility, support from people around me, and just ask plainly which of these has actually been covered in the last few weeks, and which has been quietly treated as somebody else's job. It's not a long exercise. It's usually 2 or 3 minutes, standing still, being honest about a short list instead of a vague sense of how things are going overall. Most months, exactly one sector turns out to be the one that's gone uncovered longest, and that's the one worth actually addressing before starting anything new. There's a reason I keep this monthly rather than daily, worth mentioning briefly. Checking coverage too often turns into anxious monitoring, another version of the ego trap from the last episode, where every day gets scrutinized for gaps instead of lived. Checking it monthly is close enough to catch a real pattern before it turns into an injury or a burnout stretch, and far enough apart that it doesn't turn into its own quiet source of pressure. The goal is honest coverage, not constant vigilance. And those two things aren't quite the same practice, even though they can look similar from the outside. Tomorrow morning, the run itself will only ever be one sector of the whole mission, no matter how central it feels standing at the door with your shoes on. Whatever's been left uncovered around it, quietly, for however long, doesn't need a dramatic fix. It just needs someone to notice it's exposed and start covering it, the same unglamorous way every other part of this gets built, one honest sector at a time. I think that's actually the quiet thread running underneath everything in this chapter, and maybe underneath the whole book so far. None of this was ever really about running further, or trying harder, or gritting through more discomfort on sheer will alone. It was about noticing where the real gaps are, honestly, without ego getting in the way of seeing them, and then doing the unglamorous work of closing them, one at a time, in whatever order they actually show up. The mileage was never the whole mission. It was just the part that happened to be easiest to see from the outside, and the easiest one to mistake for the entire job. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.